House of the Dragon's controversial changes from the source material set a blazing fire within the fandom. So to prepare for Season 3, I think we should do a comparative analysis and assess the critical problems of House of the Dragon Season 2 when it comes to adapting Fire and Blood. This video is spoiler free, so don't worry if you haven't read the book. Obviously, we should start with the biggest problem, and that's Alicent and Rhaenyra. This point will definitely be the longest due to how deep this issue burrows into the show's DNA. The first problem with their characters that I feel sets a good starting point is the show's insistence on both Alicent and Rhaenyra being morally good characters. Fire and Blood doesn't feature straightforward heroes. Everyone throughout the story is flawed to some degree, besides a few characters like Corlys, who is pretty base throughout the dance. Notably, this aspect of moral purity is very problematic for a character like Alicent, and I'll focus primarily on her first.
Reluctance to murder is not a weakness.
In Fire and Blood, she's one of the main villains. She's a primary driving force for the Greens. Ryan Condal for the show opts to turn her character more into a reluctant antagonist, borderlining on being a flat-out protagonist at times. Now, to argue Ryan's case, changing Alicent to this extent achieves a more sympathetic viewpoint from which we view the Greens and their internal struggles. This can work in theory, but I think Ryan vastly overshoots Alicent's morality to a point in which it breaks her character. She's forsaking her children, is okay with them being executed, and her acting like the war is preventable without further consequences is completely idiotic. Then the worst thing about Season 2's ending scene is Alicent giving Rhaenyra intel that grants her a killing blow on the Greens, telling her that Aemond and Cole will be leading a host to Harrenhal, so she'll be able to sack the city without having to worry about Vhagar. A crazy choice that borderline puts Alicent on Team Black at this point. This information in the book comes from spies who are loyal to Daemon. It's by no means Alicent freely giving this up, and showcases a strength the Blacks have over the Greens. They have inside agents and people that are still loyal to their cause, like the Goldcloaks. This final moment with Alicent fundamentally compromises her base objective in the story, to rise up her family and take the throne. Ryan and Sarah Hess are changing her into being a virtuous character who only pursues that path, assuming it's under at least some kind of honorable pretext. Ryan here makes a critical change for Alicent, where she actually believes that Viserys changed his mind on his deathbed when he said Aegon's name. At the time in Season 1, you could interpret this moment as Alicent using this as confirmation bias, so she feels more vindicated in committing treason, while deep down, she probably knows that that's bullshit and she's lying to herself. Like, everyone on the small council automatically assumed she was lying, and she was just laying a uniform false pretext to instate Aegon as king. However, in Season 2, when Rhaenyra meets up with Alicent in her ridiculous Great Sept scene, Alicent is shocked when Rhaenyra clarifies that Viserys was rambling on about Aegon the Conqueror. From here, it becomes clear that Alicent genuinely thought Viserys intended on Aegon being king. She's utterly gutted and taken aback, with a wave of sorrow and regret washing over her character. This change from the book is all done in an attempt to morally absolve Alicent from being evil, undercutting her inherent objective.
History will paint you a villain, a cold queen, grasping for power and then defeated.
Personally, and while still keeping the sympathetic viewpoint intact, I think Alicent should be written to where she still strives to win, but not to an extent of committing war atrocities for funsies. She can act to temper the worst impulses of her children and course-correct their war effort in the right direction, similar to Otto Hightower before he was dismissed. In essence, she should be the voice of reason and not the voice of wanting to surrender. This still accomplishes Ryan's goal of having a viewpoint on the green side that we relate to and understand. Alicent may not want bloodshed or to needlessly kill so many people, and that aspect about her is the angle of sympathy that should be focused on. Now, to clarify for Fire and Blood, characters are like vague portraits in the book. It comes down to Ryan and Sarah to color in and flesh out characters, and to give them some credit, they do a good job with most of them. An outstanding example being Viserys Targaryen and creating his iconic arc in Season 1. And even for Alicent, she becomes more sophisticated in the show. She's a product of Otto's aspirations and lifelong manipulations, which introduces an aspect of the audience feeling pity for her. This was a life that was forced on her. She's inherently a victim at a base level. Ryan also expands on Alicent and Rhaenyra's relationship as teens, highlighting the tragedy of them eventually being forced to turn on each other from external circumstances. All of this is great, and the first main misstep I think for her character was not having her arc into her more sinister self by the end of season 1. She should fully become estranged with Rhaenyra and even comes to hate her. Like an eye for an eye is the breaking point for this family dynamic. Everything falls apart, and thus, Alicent should fully start to align herself with Otto's objective of seizing the throne, instead of giving her a false and silly reason to morally justify herself and going along with all of this. This, I feel, keeps the complexity of her character as established in season 1 and brings her closer to her book counterpart. She's turned more into a villain, but isn't fully on the right when it comes to depravity and being batshit insane. From here, you'd ideally cut out her meetings with Rhaenyra, since Rhaenyra should make the calculation that this endeavor of meeting with her is a farce that doesn't make any sense. They already had peace terms sent to them at the end of season 1, not to mention that this takes place after a son for a son, and both of these mothers should be grieving and enraged. The Dance of Dragons is a horrific and arduous civil war, plagued with atrocities that drive certain characters into extreme despair. This should further fuel these characters in hating each other, and this is now mostly addressing Rhaenyra, where she shockingly gets over Lucerys very fast. By episode 2, she already moved on, and I feel this should be the starting point for Rhaenyra becoming more rash and being quick to anger. Her arc in season 2 could be her suppressing this, accepting it, and trying to operate a war without that taking great effect. As I raised earlier, it feels like Ryan Condal is simplifying her character into being a more generic protagonist, as if having a very flawed main character would break the story. If anything, I'd argue a character is more interesting in that state. It enriches and makes their internal conflict more potent, and that's the secret sauce for creating great characters. That's why Rhaenyra in season 2 feels a bit bland or too clean. Ryan and Sarah really scrub out her bad tendencies and go even further to suppress this darker side of Rhaenyra. Like, an interesting starting point in season 2 for her was her saying,
I want Aemond Targaryen.
In this moment, she directly looks at Daemon, pretty much signaling to him and giving him a green light to carry out a scheme to kill Aemond. Things obviously go awry, which I'll talk more about Blood and Cheese during the butterfly section, and Rhaenyra, after getting a good night's sleep, is suddenly appalled to find out that Daemon did something. How dare you? Now, you could still make this moment work if Daemon called Rhaenyra out on this, that he was subtly given permission, but the writers don't address this. They entirely put the blame on Daemon. He's the bad guy and not Rhaenyra. Fire and Blood has it to where Daemon is already at Harrenhal by this point and sends a raven to Rhaenyra that he'll basically get payback. At this moment, Rhaenyra doesn't respond, and her not outright condemning it shows that she accepts it. Ryan and Sarah changing this is but one example of glorifying Rhaenyra, and to point out another big one, Fire and Blood has different points of ambiguity. It's a book told through differing accounts, and you have to take some of them with a grain of salt. So when it comes to the fate of Rhaenyra Velaryon, a common theory was that Rhaenyra had him killed. It creates this air of deviousness around her character. Is she still the realm's delight? Which is kind of the point in Fire and Blood for Rhaenyra, where her idyllic past self slowly melts away. She becomes hardened, stubborn, angrier. While for season 2, that's not really showing so far, and they jarringly bailed on that notion right away after episode 1. But going back to Rhaenyra's fate for the show, given that the story is told through the POV of characters and not historians, Ryan takes the definitive stance of Rhaenyra not killing Laenor. Of course though, this still negatively impacts the parents, but Rhaenys ends up reconciling with Rhaenyra. Some other quick examples that emphasize Rhaenyra's good side that are show exclusive are Rhaenyra intervening when Daemon stole the dragon egg, highlighting her heroic nature. She receives a good omen when the White Hart chooses her, and as a whole for season 2, she always takes the high road. The only moment that alluded to her apathetic side was her not allowing the dragon seeds to leave while trying to claim Vermithor. Genuinely an interesting character moment, but at the same time, most lords when it comes to the common folk don't really care about them. They more so care about them because they have a selfish need to be loved and want to stay in power by not being cast out. So moving forward, I hope Rhaenyra becomes more corrupted through the seasons. This is a draining war, and seeing her break down is a big part of her journey. Wars have a cost, and seeing it chip away at her is the best avenue to take to spice up the internality of her character. Going into the next point, Brian and Sarah drastically changed the plot structure of the 2 chapters in which Season 2 is based on, A Son for a Son and The Red Dragon and the Gold. For context, this time frame in the dance should be the start of the war and not, the war is coming soon. In Fire and Blood, Daemon immediately goes to Harrenhal to raise a host and leads a successful attack on Stonehenge, capturing the seat of House Bracken. Like, that whole battle at the Burning Mill in the beginning of episode 3 served a purpose. It wasn't just a random feud that spiraled out of control off screen, but a diversion for Daemon to suddenly sack Stonehenge while the Brackens were distracted, showing off Daemon's military prowess and gaining the full support of the Riverlands. Now, obviously doing all of that by episode 3 would be way too fast. You'd probably have to have that unfold by episode 6 or 7, but the show stretches this out for the whole season, and while I don't dislike Daemon's approach in the political theater with Oscar Tully, it very much shifts the narrative into a state of it not seeming like we're actually at war yet. Even on different fronts in the book, the Lannisters are pressured and are attacked by the Red Kraken from the Iron Islands, and the Hightower hosts are getting attacked throughout their journey from houses like Beesbury. The Reach in general is vastly divided. The only war element that the show thankfully keeps is Kristen Cole's plotline in Rook's Rest. So that's the context of where the war should be, and Ryan instead directly stated in the House of the Dragon podcast that Season 2 is about trying to avoid war at all costs. That's the thematic crux of the season. It's about the women behind the scenes trying to avert this war. Having this be the crux or focal point shifts the narrative focus too far and completely misaligns with what Fire and Blood is about during this time in the story. You can argue that these events, like Alicent and Rhaenyra's meetings, wouldn't show up in the books because they happen in secrecy and maesters wouldn't be aware of them, but there's still massive deviations regardless, where these scenes borderline assassinate or completely misrepresent the characters. Ryan Condal also admits on the podcast that he always intended to end Season 2 on Alicent meeting Rhaenyra, meaning that our perception that the ending of Season 2 was because of the writer's strike or budget constraints may be false, unless if Ryan is covering for HBO or something. So this all points to a fundamental misunderstanding of the current chapter that House of the Dragon is adapting, completely changing the focus, and I'd argue for the worse because these attempts at stopping the war are riddled with logical issues, further deviate the characters from their book counterparts, and drastically slow down the pace. Which, let's talk about pace, because the pace of Season 2, if it stayed more in line with the book, should have been much faster. The show is like 2 episodes behind where it should be narratively, or honestly having 10 episodes would have been a godsend. So to stretch out the text, Season 2 hosts a lot of repetitive scenes. The Black Council always features the same subject and never goes anywhere. Daemon has almost a dozen dream scenes. Corlys isn't allowed to leave the shipyard. Mysaria and Rhaenyra have a lot of screen time. And really the only repetitive setting in Season 2 that works is the Green Council, because there, you actually have a collection of interesting characters, all with clashing motives and rich dynamics. The Black Council, in comparison for how much time we spend here, is really not worth it. If I were to hold on a close-up of Rhaenyra at this table, you'd have a very hard time trying to remember everyone on this council. So since Ryan has a predestination of where he wants to end Season 2, and that endpoint not being far enough into the story, that means he has to spin the meta metaphorical plot wheels. The only place I can understand elaborating on the text is Daemon's time in Harrenhal. The book doesn't really cover this at all and glosses over it pretty much entirely. House of the Dragon exploring the mystique of Harrenhal and how it influences Daemon and brings forth his inner demons so that he has to confront them is genuinely interesting. It gives Daemon a solid arc that he otherwise didn't have. He had a handful of great scenes in season 2, albeit for his character arc. It is a bit silly that one of the reasons he rejoins Rhaenyra's side is because of the Song of Ice and Fire vision, and him realizing that the story is larger than himself. Thankfully though, there's other aspects of his arc that still push him in that direction, and it isn't just that. Everything else that slows down the pace in season 2, I don't think is as deserving of its screen time, and even for Daemon, there were definitely still too many dream scenes. If Ryan was able to adapt the burning mill properly and subtracted some of the scenes of Daemon tripping balls, then that would have been an excellent season 2 arc for Daemon. The same applies for the rest of the season, where if the pace was tighter and we were able to finish out the Red Dragon and the Gold chapter that they're adapting, instead of getting like 2/3 of the way through it, then season 2 would have been far better and thus more faithful. For the next topic of altered core message, I briefly brought up how Ryan and Sarah focused heavily on Rhaenyra and Alicent having this burden and responsibility of subverting this war. To elaborate on this very much injects a message in season 2 where they primarily showcase the women as the level-headed, rational adults, while all the men do is crave war. This is a pretty touchy subject, of course, and I want to first clarify that the role of gender in the Dance of Dragons is a crucial through line. Rhaenyra's sex and her being named heir is what kickstarts everything. She has to prove that she's worthy of this title in a patriarchal society that places importance on men. That's what makes her journey so compelling and inspiring. Season 2 also naturally features some points of conflict of Rhaenyra's council questioning if she's a capable ruler. Is she the gentler sex, as they say? So that's another added level of conflict, and while most of these scenes could be better, it's something that should be explored. The issue from here more or less arises from the fact that Ryan and Sarah crowd the 3 main female characters, Alicent, Rhaenyra, and Rhaenys, into the category of knowing what's right. They're portrayed as being morally superior to everyone, while all the men are in the other category of being hot-headed or wanting to pursue war. It's their nature. They crave this at a fundamental level. Almost every Black Council scene is based around Rhaenyra or Rhaenys chastising characters for being so depraved as to even think about the notion of fighting this war on their behalf, even though they just rejected peace terms and the war has already been initiated. This, of course, is a logical contradiction, and thus it makes the messaging feel forced for these female characters to take the high road still. At what point does logical thinking override the messaging here? You can't keep taking this moral high ground given the context of the story. So to me, this kind of breaks the illusion of storytelling. Ryan and Sarah have a clear message they want to say, but they're not communicating it in a nuanced or natural manner, or even having at least some level-headed male characters to balance out this dichotomy as to not make it so black and white. It becomes a very tribalistic male versus female topic that feels a bit over the top, and while the story should still feature this general idea to a degree, I just don't think Ryan and Sarah go about it in an authentic and genuine way. So yeah, that's kind of that hot topic addressed, and I don't feel like I need to dive into it much further. For the last point, and I'll do so in a non-spoilery manner, we should address the butterflies. Or if people aren't aware, the butterflies refers to the cascading rippling effects of making major changes earlier on in a story that have consequences later. George R. R. Martin, in his infamous Butterfly Deleted blog post, where he criticized the show, dove into Maelor Targaryen, the second son that Aegon and Helaena have, and is present during Blood and Cheese for Fire and Blood. In the book, Helaena is forced to choose a son to be killed. Naturally, as any mother would do, she chooses the younger son, Maelor. However, given Blood's depravity, he kills Prince Jaehaerys instead, potentially scarring the younger Maelor that his mother chose him, and this sends Helaena into a state of inconsolable grief. Ryan Condal obviously adapts this differently and doesn't include Maelor. This is a rather head-scratching change because it's easily possible to adapt the book version of this scene, but apparently, Ryan brought up budget constraints in terms of hiring another child actor and they didn't include him. Whether that statement is truthful is up for debate, but regardless, this left a worrying change of Maelor not being around. You may think that, oh, these younger children on both sides of the war probably won't be that important, right? Nope, that's not the case. They definitely are. This would be like cutting out Rickon Stark from Game of Thrones, or a more appropriate example would be Jean Poole. She's a character that wouldn't be integral in the earlier seasons. However, she activates in a big way in what would have been season 5. In the books, she takes Sansa's place of being sent to Ramsay, and she instead cosplays as Arya Stark. Since David and Dan didn't include Jean Poole, they had to jerry-rig that plot with Sansa taking her place, and that ended up decimating Littlefinger's character, a la the butterfly effect in a rippling consequence. So looking back over at House of the Dragon, everyone serves a direct purpose, even the little kids. Now, in the latest season 3 trailer, it looks like Helaena is giving birth, so this point could be rectified. You can technically still achieve the plot point with Maelor as an infant, and we'll see if that is the case when season 3 releases. It just seems a little odd that's happening because Helaena was clearly not pregnant in season 2, or from what I'm aware of. Maybe I'm mistaken despite just rewatching season 2, and they're not in a position to be doing time jumps. The timeline in general is kind of messed up, and I guess we'll see how that shakes up, but for Maelor, he's all but one butterfly. Staying on the subject of the kids, Rhaenyra's children have also largely been absent. There's Joffrey, the third son she has with Sir Harwin, that she gives birth to in season 1, episode 6, and then there's Aegon III, or what the book calls him, Aegon the Younger, and then there's Viserys. The last two are kids she had with Daemon. These three kids all have a distinct purpose and so far haven't really been featured at all. Notably, Joffrey has had at least some development in the book, and some other big changes are his age being downgraded from 13 to 6, and he doesn't have a dragon. Whether the plot points surrounding him will have the same efficacy in the show will remain to be seen, and hopefully Ryan Condal places more emphasis on him in season 3. Aegon and Viserys as well are significantly younger, basically babies in the show, and again, it's questionable how the events surrounding them will play out in House of the Dragon. So I don't know if Ryan Condal is going to go on a retconning spree and will suddenly age up all of these characters, despite the dance only lasting a couple years in its entirety. It's quite puzzling why he made them all so much younger. Then, moving away from talking about kitties, another major change is cutting out the character Nettles. She's another dragon seed, similar to Ulf and Hugh, and she ended up taming Sheepstealer. In order to do so, she brought the dragon's sheep over time to lower the dragon's aggression and ultimately tame it. Which I find interesting in that you have to take extra more unique steps to tame the wild dragons. While it seems like Rhaena will end up just taming Sheepstealer normally, ideally on screen. The show here opts to combine Rhaena and Nettles, unless if Nettles randomly shows up and pacifies Rhaena before she claims Sheepstealer. On the surface for combining them, this may seem alright because Rhaena is a character that lacks agency, but at the same time, that's kind of the point. In season 2, Rhaenyra asked Rhaena to reconcile with the fact that she needs to take care of the children because she's the future of their house. She's the embodiment of hope. The book version of Rhaena stays in the Vale as Jane Eyre's ward, and in that time, one of the dragon eggs hatches and Rhaena's hopes of getting a dragon are fulfilled. From here, she has a pretty specific destination for her endpoint, but in combining her character with Nettles, that means she pretty much adopts Nettles' arc, while also probably changing it immensely because she's inherently not the same character. In Fire and Blood, Nettles and her endpoint has a pretty specific purpose, and whether or not Ryan Condal fulfills that same purpose with Rhaena will probably be unlikely. So these butterflies as a whole raises a general question of why change these elements from Fire and Blood? It's not really making the story better. There are multiple examples that point to this, like Rhaenys being at Aegon's coronation, and the biggest one in season 2 is Blood and Cheese. Everyone essentially agrees that it was better in the book, and while the show version is still good, it could have easily have been more faithful and highlighted the horrific mind game that Helaena endures. That moment is also crucial for her arc, and so far it largely seems to not affect her that much by the end of season 2. This highlights a general mantra that has made George R. R. Martin kind of crash out, where he's tired of writers adapting stories thinking they can do better, needlessly changing things and oftentimes for the worse, with writers being deluded with the fact that the material they're adapting is suddenly their own. This kind of devolves even further where Ryan Condal has cut off George, no longer listening to his feedback, and it's not like some of George's criticisms were unwarranted. This of course is pretty disrespectful because as someone who's adapting someone else's work, you have an inherent obligation to be faithful. There is a degree of change that is warranted between mediums, and you can elevate the source at some points, like giving Daemon a character arc in season 2, but Ryan and Sarah lose the plot and borderline are molding the show into something that George flat out dislikes. We'll see how season 3 pans out, and it'll probably not be as bad as season 2 because it'll basically be all out war now and primarily be action based. Although, I wouldn't be surprised if Ryan Condal still finds a way to mess things up. Character-wise, I'm mostly holding my breath, and there are other certain POVs that seem to be added like Aegon and Larys's journey. Will that be warranted? Who knows? Thanks for watching, and my Letterboxd, Discord, and Patreon links are in the description. Thanks as usual to my top patron, Logan Farmer.